They said words can't hurt anyone until mine did. I didn't write to destroy Afard, I wrote to reveal. Every line I published was a truth they tried to bury. And when the truth refused to stay silent, they came for me. I wasn't armed with anything, Kalea, only a pen. But in their eyes, that was enough to make me dangerous.
They said words can't hurt anyone until mine did. I didn't write to destroy as I wrote to reveal. Every line I published was a truth they tried to bury, and when the truth refused to stay silent, they came for me. I wasn't armed with anything, only a pen, but in their eyes that was enough to make me dangerous. My name is Daniel Carter, and I never imagined that telling the truth would cost me everything. It was a Tuesday morning in September, when 2 federal agents knocked on my apartment door in downtown Philadelphia. The sound echoed through the hallway like a judge's gavel, final and unforgiving. I was still in my pajamas, coffee cup halfway to my lips, when I opened the door to see their stone-cold faces. "Daniel Carter?" the taller one asked, though he clearly already knew the answer. "Yes, you're under arrest for criminal defamation, incitement to public disorder, and conspiracy to damage protected reputations under Federal Statute 18 U.S.C., paragraph 2385. The words hit me like a physical blow. My coffee cup slipped from my hand, shattering against the hardwood floor. Brown liquid spread like a stain of guilt I didn't feel. "There must be some mistake," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. "No mistake, Mr. Carter. You have the right to remain silent." But I couldn't stay silent. That was the whole problem. That's what got me here. 3 months earlier, I had published an investigative article on my independent journalism website, The Unveiled Truth. It wasn't a big operation, just me, my laptop, and an unshakable belief that someone needed to speak up. The article was titled, "The Golden Circle: How Philadelphia's Elite Built an Empire on Broken Backs." I had spent 2 years researching it. 2 years of late nights, encrypted messages with whistleblowers, documents smuggled out of offices in manila envelopes. What I uncovered was a web of corruption so deep, so systematic, that it involved some of the most powerful people in Pennsylvania: a U.S. senator, 3 city council members, the police commissioner, and the CEO of the largest real estate development company in the state. They had orchestrated a scheme to displace over 2,000 low-income families from the Riverside neighborhood using fraudulent safety inspections and intimidation tactics. The land was then sold to developers for pennies on the dollar, and luxury condos rose where children once played in the streets. I named names. I provided documents. I interviewed families who had lost everything. The article went viral. Within 48 hours, it had over 3 million views. News outlets picked it up. Protests erupted outside City Hall. People were angry, rightfully so, but power doesn't like to be exposed. Within a week, I started receiving threatening phone calls, anonymous voices telling me to watch my back or be careful crossing the street. My website was hit with multiple DDoS attacks. My email was hacked. Someone spray-painted "liar" across my apartment building's entrance. Then came the lawsuits, 5 of them totaling $50 million in defamation claims. They weren't trying to prove I was wrong. They were trying to bury me in legal fees until I couldn't breathe. But I kept writing. I published follow-ups, more evidence, more testimonies. That's when they changed tactics. Instead of just suing me in civil court, they used their political connections to have me arrested on federal charges. They claimed my articles were deliberately inciting violence and conspiring to destroy the reputations of public servants. They twisted the First Amendment into a noose around my neck. As the agents handcuffed me and led me down the stairs of my building, neighbors peeked through cracked doors. Some looked sympathetic, others looked afraid, as if my guilt might be contagious. In the back of the police car, watching Philadelphia's skyline blur past the window, I realized something that made my blood run cold. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about whether the truth could survive in a country that claimed to protect it. And I was about to find out if words were really mightier than power, or if power could silence words forever. The holding cell smelled like despair and disinfectant. I sat on a metal bench, head in my hands, trying to process what had just happened. Around me, other inmates muttered to themselves or stared blankly at the concrete walls. A man in the corner was sobbing quietly. Another paced back and forth like a caged animal, I was one of them now, a criminal. At least that's what the system wanted everyone to believe. My one phone call went to my lawyer, Marcus Webb, a civil rights attorney I'd met years ago at a journalism conference. He was in court when I called, but his paralegal promised he'd come as soon as possible. Hours crawled by. I counted the cracks in the ceiling, 37. I memorized the graffiti scratched into the walls. Someone had written, "The truth will set you free, but first it will make you miserable." I laughed bitterly. How appropriate. When Marcus finally arrived, his face was grave. We sat across from each other in a small consultation room, separated by a scratched plexiglass divider. "Daniel," he said slowly, "this is serious. They're not playing around. I know." "No, I don't think you do." He pulled out a thick folder of documents. "They've charged you under rarely used federal statutes. If convicted, you're looking at up to 15 years in federal prison, and that's not including the civil suits, which could leave you bankrupt for the rest of your life." 15 years. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. But I told the truth, Marcus. Everything I published was true. I have proof. Truth is a defense in defamation cases, yes, but they're not just charging you with defamation. They're claiming you incited violence and engaged in conspiracy. That's murkier territory. He leaned closer. "Daniel, 3 people were injured in the protests after your article came out. They're saying you're responsible." "That's insane. I never called for violence. I never." "I know, but they're going to argue that your words were so inflammatory, so reckless that violence was a foreseeable consequence. They'll say you knew what would happen and published anyway." I felt sick, Marcus continued, his voice softer now. "There's something else you need to know. The prosecution has offered a deal." "What kind of deal?" "They'll drop all criminal charges if you publicly retract your article, issue a formal apology, and agree never to write about any of the individuals named in your piece again. Essentially, you'd be admitting you lied." The room felt like it was closing in on me. "And if I don't, then we go to trial, and I have to be honest with you. This is going to be an uphill battle. They have resources we can't match. They'll drag this out, bleed you dry, and turn public opinion against you. Even if we win, it'll take years." I stared at my hands, trembling on the table. Everything I'd worked for, everything I believed in, came down to this moment. If I took the deal, I'd be free. I could go home, sleep in my own bed, try to rebuild my life. But I'd also be admitting that telling the truth was a crime. I'd be teaching every other journalist that power always wins, that silence is safer than speaking up. If I fought, I might lose everything. My freedom, my career, maybe even my life. But at least I'd still be able to look at myself in the mirror. "No deal," I said quietly. Marcus nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this answer. "Then we fight." I stood in that Philadelphia holding cell, but this story could happen anywhere. What city do you think fights like this are happening in right now? Drop the name in the comments. You might be surprised how close to home this really is. Freedom came with a price tag. Marcus managed to get me released on bail, $250,000, paid by mortgaging my late mother's house in suburban Chester. Walking out of that detention center felt surreal, like emerging from underwater. The sunlight hurt my eyes. The noise of the city felt overwhelming after days of silence. But freedom was relative. I was fitted with an ankle monitor, restricted from leaving Philadelphia County, and forbidden from contacting any of the sources I'd quoted in my article. They wanted to isolate me, cut me off from the very people who could prove I was telling the truth. Marcus and I set up a war room in his law office, a cramped space above a Vietnamese restaurant in Chinatown. The walls were covered with documents, timelines, photographs. We worked 16-hour days, surviving on coffee and takeout. "We need to prove 3 things, Marcus explained, drawing on the whiteboard. 1, everything you published was true. 2, you acted as a responsible journalist, verifying your sources and facts. 3, you never incited violence, you exposed it." The first part seemed straightforward. I had documents, leaked emails showing the scheme, building inspection reports that had been falsified, bank records tracing the money, testimony from displaced families. But when Marcus started reaching out to my sources, we hit a wall. People were terrified. Mrs. Patricia Johnson, a 63-year-old grandmother who'd lost her home of 40 years, initially agreed to testify. Then, 3 days later, she called Marcus in tears. "I can't do it," she sobbed over the phone, which we had on speaker. "2 men came to my daughter's house. They didn't threaten us directly, but they made it clear. They know where my grandchildren go to school. I'm so sorry, Mr. Carter, I'm so sorry. I felt my heart sink. "It's okay, Mrs. Johnson, I understand. I'm sorry I put you in this position." After she hung up, I slammed my fist on the table. "They're intimidating witnesses." "I know," Marcus said grimly, "and there's not much we can do about it. These people have power and no moral boundaries." One by one, our witnesses fell away. The former city inspector who'd been forced to file false reports suddenly couldn't recall the details. The real estate broker who'd facilitated the land sales developed a convenient case of amnesia. Even the reporter from the Philadelphia Inquirer who'd initially praised my article started backpedaling, saying my work was provocative but unverified. The media narrative shifted against me. Op-eds appeared calling me a reckless blogger and a conspiracy theorist. Cable news pundits debated whether citizen journalism had gone too far. My face was plastered across screens with the word "arrested" stamped across it. I stopped reading the news, stopped checking social media. Every click was another knife in my back. But then, something unexpected happened. A woman named Rebecca Winters reached out through an encrypted email. She was the executive assistant to Senator Howard Blythe, one of the men I'd exposed in my article. She'd worked for him for 12 years. "I have recordings," her email said. "Meetings where they planned everything. I can prove you were right, but I need protection. Marcus and I met her in a parking garage at midnight, like something out of a spy movie. She was in her 50s, well-dressed, nervous. She handed us a thumb drive with shaking hands. 'This is everything,' she whispered. 'Why he did it, how they coordinated with the police commissioner, how they planned to discredit you if you ever got close to the truth.' I couldn't stay silent anymore. 'What they're doing to you, it's wrong. Why are you helping me?' I asked. She looked me in the eyes and I saw something I hadn't seen in weeks. Genuine courage. Because someone has to. Because if they destroy you, they'll do this to anyone who dares speak up. And because," her voice cracked, "my nephew lived in Riverside. He was one of the families you wrote about. For the first time since my arrest, I felt hope. We had our smoking gun. The tide of public opinion is a fickle thing. For weeks after my arrest, I'd been vilified. Dangerous. Reckless. Fake news. The machinery of power worked overtime to paint me as the villain in a story where I was trying to expose the real villains. But Rebecca's recordings changed everything. We couldn't use them in court yet. The trial was still months away. But Marcus had a strategy. Leak them to the press strategically. Let the court of public opinion shift before we ever stepped into a courtroom. We sent copies to 3 journalists we trusted, reporters who'd built careers on investigating corruption, not parroting press releases. Within 48 hours, the story exploded. Secret recordings reveal senator's plot to silence journalist. The Washington Post. Tapes show coordination between public officials to frame writer. ProPublica. Did Philadelphia's elite criminalize the truth? The Atlantic. The recordings were damning. In one, Senator Blythe's voice was crystal clear. "We need to make an example of Carter. If we let him get away with this, every 2-bit blogger with a laptop will think they can destroy people's careers. We use the law. We make him the criminal." In another, Police Commissioner Frank DeLuca laughed about the arrest. "The irony is beautiful. He writes about us abusing power, and we use our power to shut him up. It's almost poetic." The public reaction was swift and fierce. Protests erupted outside the courthouse where my trial would be held. Journalist organizations released statements defending press freedom. Whereas Free Carter now trended on Twitter. Donations flooded into my legal defense fund, small amounts from ordinary people who believed in what I'd tried to do. But with support came backlash. Senator Blythe held a press conference, his face a mask of righteous indignation. "These recordings are taken out of context," he declared. "This is a desperate attempt by a guilty man to smear innocent public servants. We will not be intimidated by conspiracy theories and edited audio." The police union released a statement calling me an enemy of law enforcement. Pro-Blythe groups organized counter-protests. I received death threats, hundreds of them. Someone mailed a bullet to Marcus's office with a note, "Justice is coming." My life became a nightmare of security concerns. I couldn't go to a coffee shop without someone recognizing me, some to offer support, others to spit insults. I wore baseball caps and sunglasses everywhere, like a fugitive in my own city. The psychological toll was crushing. I stopped sleeping more than a few hours a night. I lost 20 pounds. I'd wake up in cold sweats dreaming of prison cells and guilty verdicts. One night, alone in my apartment, I broke down. I called my younger sister Emily, who lived in Boston. She'd been my rock through all of this. calling every day, sending care packages, refusing to let me give up. I don't know if I can do this, I told her through tears. Maybe I should have just taken the deal. Maybe I was being stubborn and stupid. And now I've dragged everyone into this mess. You, Marcus, Rebecca, all these people supporting me. What if we lose? What if I go to prison and it's all for nothing? Emily was quiet for a moment. Then, in the firm voice she'd inherited from our mother, she said, "Daniel, do you remember what Mom used to say? The cost of silence is always higher than the cost of speaking. You didn't choose this fight because it was easy. You chose it because it was necessary. Those people destroyed families, they broke the law, they abused their power, and when you exposed them, they tried to destroy you. But you know what? They haven't. You're still standing, and you're not alone." Her words steadied me. She was right. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about whether ordinary people could challenge power without being crushed. It was about whether journalism still meant something. It was about whether the truth mattered at all. I wiped my eyes and returned to the document spread across my kitchen table. The trial was 3 weeks away, and I had work to do. The courtroom felt like a cathedral of judgment. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, an American flag standing sentinel beside the judge's bench. I sat at the defense table, wearing the only suit I owned, trying to keep my hands from shaking. Jury selection had taken 2 grueling days. The prosecution tried to eliminate anyone sympathetic to journalists, to free speech, to the idea that powerful people could be corrupt. The defense, Marcus and his small team, fought to keep anyone who valued truth over authority. We ended up with 12 jurors, a retired teacher, a warehouse manager, a freelance graphic designer, a hospital administrator, an electrician, a stay-at-home father, a bank teller, a small business owner, a college student, a software developer, a hairstylist, and a postal worker. 12 ordinary people who would decide my fate. The lead prosecutor was a woman named Victoria Hastings, sharp, mid-50s, with a reputation for never losing. She wore expensive suits and had a way of speaking that made every word sound like an undeniable fact. Her opening statement was devastating. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, pacing before the jury box, "this case is about responsibility. It's about the difference between journalism and recklessness, between free speech and dangerous speech. The defendant, Daniel Carter, fancies himself a truth-teller, but the truth is, his words had consequences, real consequences. 3 people were injured in riots that erupted after he published false and inflammatory accusations against respected public servants. He didn't care about facts. He didn't care about verification. He cared about clicks, about attention, about tearing down people who've dedicated their lives to serving this community." She paused, letting her words sink in. "The First Amendment is not a shield for lies. Freedom of the press is not a license to destroy reputations without evidence. And when speech crosses the line into incitement, into causing harm, society has a right, a duty, to hold that person accountable. That's why we're here today. Not to silence the truth, but to punish reckless falsehoods that endangered lives and destroyed careers." I felt the weight of every eye in the courtroom on me. Some jurors looked at me with suspicion, others with curiosity. One, the teacher, looked at me with something that might have been sympathy. Then it was Marcus's turn. He stood slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. He was younger than Hastings, African-American, with a quiet intensity that commanded attention without demanding it. "Members of the jury," he began, his voice steady and clear, "the prosecution wants you to believe this case is about responsibility. They're right, but not in the way they think. This case is about the responsibility of power, the responsibility to tell the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable." He walked toward the jury, making eye contact with each of them. "Daniel Carter is not a reckless blogger. He's an investigative journalist who spent 2 years researching one of the largest corruption scandals in Philadelphia's history. He didn't publish rumors. He published documents, emails, bank records, testimony from victims. Everything he wrote was true, and the prosecution knows it." Marcus let that hang in the air. "So why are we here? Because powerful people don't like being exposed. Because when you threaten billion-dollar schemes and political careers, those people fight back. And how do they fight back? Not by proving Mr. Carter wrong. They can't, because he wasn't wrong. They fight back by making him the criminal, by twisting the law to punish truth-telling, by using the very system meant to protect us to silence those who expose its corruption." He turned back to face the jury. "The prosecution will show you images of protests, of injured people, and they'll blame Mr. Carter. But reporting the truth about injustice is not inciting violence. It's doing what journalists have always done, shining light into dark places. If we convict a journalist for exposing corruption, we're not protecting society, we're protecting the corrupt. And that's a precedent none of us should want to set. As Marcus returned to our table and sat beside me, I felt a flicker of hope. The battle had begun, and the truth was finally getting its day in court. Victoria Hastings built her case like a surgeon wielding a scalpel, precise, methodical, designed to cut deep. Her first witness was Senator Howard Blythe himself. He took the stand in an impeccable navy suit, American flag pin on his lapel, silver hair perfectly combed. He looked like Central Casting's version of a trustworthy politician. When he placed his hand on the Bible to be sworn in, I felt my stomach turn. "Senator Blythe," Hastings began warmly, "can you tell the jury about your career in public service?" "Of course." His voice was smooth, practiced. "I've served the people of Pennsylvania for 32 years, 15 years in the state Senate, then 17 years in the U.S. Senate. I've dedicated my entire adult life to making this state a better place for working families. And the defendant, Mr. Carter, wrote an article accusing you of orchestrating a scheme to displace low-income families. Is that correct?" "Yes." Blythe's face arranged itself into an expression of wounded dignity. "It was one of the most painful experiences of my life. I've never been accused of something so vile, so completely false. Did you orchestrate any such scheme?" "Absolutely not. The Riverside redevelopment project was conducted entirely by the book. Every family was compensated fairly. Every legal procedure was followed. Mr. Carter's article was nothing but malicious fiction designed to damage my reputation and my ability to serve." "And what impact did his article have on your life?" Blythe's voice wavered convincingly. "It destroyed me. My approval ratings plummeted. I received death threats. My grandchildren were bullied at school. People who'd known me for decades suddenly questioned my character, all because of lies. I wanted to scream. Every word was a performance, a carefully rehearsed script. But I sat still, knowing any outburst would only hurt our case. Marcus's cross-examination was sharp. "Senator Blythe, you say every family was compensated fairly. How much was Mrs. Patricia Johnson compensated for her home?" Blythe hesitated. "I don't recall specific amounts. The records show she received $47,000 for a home she'd owned for 40 years. The property was then sold to developers for $380,000. Does that seem fair to you? I wasn't involved in individual transactions, but you just testified that everything was done fairly. Were you lying then, or are you lying now?" "Objection." Hastings was on her feet. "Argumentative." "Sustained," the judge said. "Rephrase, Mr. Webb." Marcus nodded. "Senator, have you ever met with representatives from Keystone Development Group?" "I meet with many people." "Yes or no, Senator?" "Yes." "Did you meet with them to discuss the Riverside property before the displacement began?" A pause. "I may have." "You may have, or you did." "I did." "And did you receive any financial contributions from Keystone Development Group or its executives?" Another pause, longer this time. "Campaign contributions are a matter of public record." "I'll take that as a yes. In fact, Keystone Development donated $340,000 to your re-election campaign in the 6 months surrounding the Riverside project. Isn't that correct?" Blythe's composure cracked slightly. "That doesn't prove anything. It proves you had a financial relationship with the very company that profited from the displacement Mr. Carter wrote about. Nothing further." The prosecution's next witnesses were more effective. They called a shopkeeper whose store had been vandalized during protests, a police officer who'd been hit with a bottle, a woman who'd been trampled in the crowd. Each testified about the fear and chaos, and each time Hastings would ask, "And when did these protests begin?" "Right after that article came out," they'd say. The message was clear. I had lit the match, and people had been burned. By the end of the second day of testimony, the jury looked troubled. I could see it in their faces. Doubt creeping in, the question forming, even if Carter told the truth, did his truth cause harm? That night, Marcus and I reviewed our strategy. "We need to hit harder," I said. "We will," Marcus assured me. "Tomorrow we start presenting our case, and we have something they don't." "What's that?" He smiled grimly. "The actual truth." Our first witness was Rebecca Winters. She walked to the stand with the bearing of someone who'd already made peace with the consequences of her decision. Her hands trembled slightly as she was sworn in, but her voice was steady. Marcus approached her gently. "Ms. Winters, can you tell the jury about your employment? I was executive assistant to Senator Howard Blythe for 12 years, until last month. Why did you leave? Because I couldn't participate in a lie anymore. Because what they're doing to Mr. Carter is wrong and I couldn't stay silent. You could feel the tension in the courtroom shift. Jurors leaned forward. Ms. Winters, did you bring certain recordings to Mr. Carter's defense team? Yes. I recorded meetings over the course of 18 months. Meetings where Senator Blythe and others discussed the Riverside project. And what did those recordings reveal? Rebecca looked directly at the jury. They revealed that everything in Mr. Carter's article was true. The senator, Police Commissioner DeLuca, City Councilman Torres, and executives from Keystone Development coordinated the entire scheme. They falsified inspection reports to condemn buildings. They used intimidation tactics on families who wouldn't sell. They manipulated zoning laws. And when Mr. Carter published his article, they planned exactly how to destroy him, including having him arrested on false charges. The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel for order. Hastings shot to her feet. Objection. This witness has not been qualified as an expert, and she's making sweeping conclusions. Your Honor, Marcus interrupted. Miss Winters is testifying to what she personally heard and recorded. These are not conclusions, they're observations. I'll allow it, the judge ruled. Continue. Marcus played excerpts from the recordings. Senator Blythe's voice filled the courtroom. We need to make an example of Carter, and we use the law, we make him the criminal. Several jurors' eyes widened. One shook his head in disgust. Hastings' cross-examination was brutal. She attacked Rebecca's character, her motivations, suggesting she'd been fired and was seeking revenge. But Rebecca held firm. I wasn't fired, she said calmly. I quit, because participating in this would have made me complicit in destroying an innocent man. Our next witness was Dr. James Martinez, a forensic accountant who'd analyzed the financial records I'd obtained. He walked the jury through a labyrinth of shell companies, dummy transactions, and kickbacks. He showed how money had flowed from Keystone Development to offshore accounts linked to Senator Blythe and his associates. Millions of dollars in bribes disguised as consulting fees and speaking engagements. In my 23 years of analyzing financial crimes, Dr. Martinez testified, this is one of the most sophisticated corruption schemes I've encountered. Mr. Carter's article didn't just skim the surface, it exposed the entire network. Then we called Maria Gonzalez, a single mother who'd been forced from her Riverside home. She cried as she described how inspectors had condemned her building, claiming it was structurally unsound, how she'd hired an independent engineer who found nothing wrong, how men in dark suits had visited her, suggesting it would be easier if she just took the buyout offer, how she'd lost everything. Mr. Carter's article was the first time anyone cared, she said, tears streaming down her face. The first time anyone said what happened to us was wrong. He gave us a voice when everyone else pretended we didn't exist. By the end of our witness testimony, the narrative had shifted. This wasn't about a reckless blogger destroying reputations. It was about a journalist exposing a criminal conspiracy and powerful people trying to punish him for it. But we still had to address the violence. Marcus called Dr. Angela Chen, a sociologist who studied protests and social movements. Dr. Chen, Marcus asked, in your expert opinion, did Mr. Carter's article incite the violence that occurred during the protests? No, she said firmly. Violence at protests is complex. It's usually the result of multiple factors: police tactics, agent provocateurs, opportunistic actors. But journalistic reporting of injustice is not incitement. If it were, we'd have to arrest every reporter who's ever exposed wrongdoing that led to public anger. That's not how the First Amendment works. The prosecution had tried to make me a villain, but we were showing the jury who the real villains were. The courtroom was packed for closing arguments. Journalists filled the gallery. Supporters wearing "Try and Free Carter Now" t-shirts sat beside detractors who believed I'd gotten what I deserved. The energy was electric, charged with the weight of what was about to unfold. Victoria Hastings delivered her closing with the confidence of someone who'd won too many cases to doubt herself. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard a lot over the past 2 weeks. Conspiracy theories, financial documents, emotional testimony. But let's not lose sight of what this case is actually about. Responsibility. She walked along the jury box, making eye contact with each juror. Yes, there may have been questionable dealings in the Riverside project. That's for other investigations to determine. But that's not what we're here to decide. We're here to decide whether Daniel Carter acted responsibly as a journalist, whether he verified his facts, whether he considered the consequences of his words, whether he incited violence. She pointed at me. The evidence shows he did not verify adequately. He relied on anonymous sources and stolen documents. He painted respectable public servants as criminals without giving them fair opportunity to respond. And his inflammatory language, calling them corrupt, calling for justice, that language sparked riots that injured innocent people. Whatever his intentions, he is responsible for that harm. And in a society of laws, responsibility has consequences. I ask you to find him guilty on all counts. Hastings sat down, and I felt the weight of her words pressing against my chest. Then Marcus stood. He didn't walk to the jury immediately. He stood at our table, one hand resting on the stack of evidence we'd presented. Ms. Hastings wants you to believe this case is about responsibility, he began quietly. She's right. But the question is, whose responsibility? Now he walked toward the jury, his voice growing stronger. Is it Daniel Carter's responsibility that powerful men broke the law? Is it his responsibility that they displaced families, falsified documents, and enriched themselves through corruption? Is it his responsibility that when he exposed these crimes, they used their influence to have him arrested? He paused, letting the questions hang in the air. No, his only responsibility was to tell the truth, and he did. You've seen the evidence. You've heard the recordings. You've seen the financial documents. Everything Mr. Carter published was accurate. The prosecution has not challenged the truth of his article because they can't. Instead, they've tried to make you afraid of the truth. They've tried to convince you that journalists who expose wrongdoing are dangerous. Marcus's voice rose with passion. But here's what's really dangerous. A world where powerful people can commit crimes and then use the law to silence anyone who speaks up. That's not justice. That's tyranny. The First Amendment exists precisely to protect speech like Mr. Carter's. Yes, protests happened. Yes, some people were hurt, and that's tragic. But we don't arrest journalists for the unforeseeable actions of third parties. We don't criminalize truth-telling because it makes people angry. If we did, there would be no investigative journalism, no accountability, no check on power. He turned back to face the jury directly. Senator Blythe and his associates broke the law. They hurt families, they stole millions of dollars, and when Daniel Carter exposed them, they tried to destroy him. Don't let them. Don't let them turn the victim into the criminal. Find Daniel Carter not guilty. Not because you like him, but because convicting him would mean power wins, truth loses, and none of us are safe. Marcus sat down beside me. I wanted to thank him, but couldn't find the words. The judge gave the jury their instructions. They filed out 12 strangers who held my life in their hands. The wait was agony. 6 hours passed, then 8, then 12. With every passing hour, I imagined a different outcome. Guilty, not guilty. Hung jury. Each possibility felt equally terrifying. Finally, on the afternoon of the second day of deliberation, we received word. The jury had reached a verdict. My heart hammered against my ribs as we returned to the courtroom. Everyone stood as the judge entered. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. Has the jury reached a verdict? The judge asked. We have, Your Honor. This was it. The moment everything had been building toward. My entire life hung on the next words spoken. On the count of criminal defamation, how do you find? The foreperson, the retired teacher, stood. Her hands held a piece of paper that seemed to glow under the courtroom lights. We find the defendant not guilty. The courtroom exploded. Gasps, cheers, shouts of protest, all blending into a cacophony that the judge's gavel couldn't silence for several long moments. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Marcus grabbed my shoulder, squeezing hard. On the count of incitement to public disorder, how do you find? Not guilty. More eruptions. Someone in the gallery was crying. I realized it was my sister, Emily. On the count of conspiracy to damage protected reputations, how do you find? Not guilty. My legs gave out. I collapsed into my chair, head in my hands, as 3 years of weight lifted from my shoulders. Marcus was saying something, but I couldn't hear him over the ringing in my ears. The judge polled each juror individually, and each one confirmed, not guilty, not guilty, not guilty. 12 times I heard those words, and each time felt like absolution. When the judge dismissed the jury and declared me a free man, I finally looked up. Several jurors were looking at me. The teacher nodded slightly. The warehouse manager gave a small smile. They'd seen through the lies. They'd chosen truth over power. The ankle monitor would be removed tomorrow. The charges were dismissed with prejudice, meaning they couldn't be filed again. I was free, but the victory felt complicated. Outside the courthouse, a mob of reporters swarmed us. Camera flashes erupted like lightning, microphones thrust toward my face. Mr. Carter, how do you feel? What's your message to Senator Blythe? Will you continue investigating corruption? Marcus raised his hands, quieting the crowd. Mr. Carter will make a brief statement. I stepped forward, my voice hoarse from emotion. 3 years ago, I wrote an article exposing corruption. I was arrested, threatened, nearly destroyed, but I never stopped believing the truth mattered. This verdict isn't just about me, it's about whether we still live in a country where journalists can hold power accountable. Today, 12 ordinary citizens said yes. Yes, truth matters. Yes, the First Amendment means something. Yes, you cannot criminalize journalism. I paused, looking into the cameras. But this fight isn't over. The people who tried to silence me are still in power. The families displaced from Riverside still haven't received justice. And across this country, journalists are being sued, threatened and silenced for doing their jobs. If my case showed anything, it's that we cannot take press freedom for granted. We have to fight for it, every single day. The crowd erupted in applause. That night, I returned to my apartment for the first time as a truly free man. The space felt different, quieter, safer. I ordered pizza, opened a beer, and sat on my couch, staring at the wall. My phone buzzed constantly. Messages of congratulations, interview requests, people sharing my story. When Free Carter Now was trending again, but this time with celebration instead of desperation. But one message stood out. It was from an unknown number. You won this battle, but you haven't won the war. Watch your back. I stared at it for a long moment, then deleted it. They wanted me afraid. They wanted me to stop. But I'd learned something in that courtroom. Fear is just another form of control. And I was done being controlled. The next morning I sat down at my laptop and began typing a new article. The title, What They Don't Want You to Know. The corruption network that tried to silence me. If they thought prosecuting me would shut me up, they were wrong. The truth was just getting started. 6 months after the verdict, I stood in front of 300 journalism students at Columbia University, invited to speak about press freedom and investigative reporting. The auditorium was packed. Young faces looked up at me with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. They'd grown up in an era where journalism was under constant attack, where fake news had become a weapon, where reporters were threatened and truth itself seemed negotiable. I'd come to tell them it was still worth fighting for. Before we begin, I said, I want to ask you a question. How many of you still want to be journalists after hearing my story? About half the hands went up. Fewer than I'd hoped, more than I'd feared. I nodded. Good, because we need you. Desperately. I walked to the edge of the stage, closer to them. My story isn't unique. Right now, journalists around the world are being arrested, sued, killed for telling the truth. In this country, we're luckier. We have the First Amendment. But as I learned, having a right on paper doesn't mean that right can't be attacked. It has to be defended, every single day. I clicked to the first slide of my presentation, a photo of the Riverside neighborhood before the displacement. Children playing in the street, families on porches, community. This is what was destroyed, not by my article but by corruption. My article just made it visible, and that's what journalism is supposed to do, make the invisible visible. Give voice to the voiceless, hold power accountable. Next slide, my mugshot from the arrest. This is what can happen when you do that job well. You won't always be celebrated. Sometimes you'll be attacked. Your reputation will be questioned. Your motives will be doubted. People with power and money will try to silence you. I paused, making eye contact with students in the front row. So here's the lesson I want you to take from my story. Not just what happened to me, but what I learned about truth, courage, and why journalism still matters. I took a breath and continued. The lesson is this. Truth without courage is just information. But courage without truth is just noise. You need both. I let that sink in before explaining. You can have all the facts in the world, all the evidence, all the proof, but if you're too afraid to publish it, too worried about the consequences, too concerned about making powerful people angry, then the truth stays hidden. It stays buried, and injustice continues. But, and this is crucial, you also can't just be brave for the sake of being brave. Courage without truth is recklessness. It's publishing rumors. It's making accusations without evidence. It's confusing your opinions with facts. That's not journalism, that's irresponsibility. I clicked to another slide showing the courtroom. Real journalism requires both: the courage to speak up and the integrity to get it right, the willingness to face consequences and the discipline to verify everything, the passion to expose wrongdoing and the professionalism to do it responsibly. A student raised her hand. But Mr. Carter, you almost went to prison. You lost everything. Was it worth it? I smiled. That's the question, isn't it? And honestly, some days I still don't know. I lost friends, I lost money, I lost years of my life to stress and fear, but I looked around the room. Those families in Riverside, they got justice. Senator Blythe resigned and is now under federal investigation. The police commissioner was fired. The corruption network I exposed is being dismantled, and journalists across the country saw that they could stand up to power and win. Was it worth it? Ask the families who got their voices heard. Ask the next journalist who won't be intimidated because they saw someone fight back and survive. Ask yourself what kind of world you want to live in, one where truth is dangerous or one where truth is defended. I walked back to center stage. Here's what I know for certain. The truth is always worth fighting for, even when it costs you, especially when it costs you. Because the moment we stop fighting for truth, we lose everything that makes us free. The auditorium was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, someone started clapping. Then another. Then the whole room erupted in applause. I looked at those young faces and saw the future of journalism. Some would give up, discouraged by the obstacles, but others would fight. They'd investigate. They'd expose. They'd tell stories that needed to be told. And that gave me hope. After the speech, dozens of students lined up to ask questions, to share their own stories, to tell me they were inspired to keep pursuing truth despite the risks. One young woman, probably 22, waited until the end. She approached nervously. "Mr. Carter, I'm from a small town where the mayor is corrupt. Everyone knows it, but no one says anything because he's powerful and vengeful. I've been documenting everything, but I'm scared to publish. What do you tell someone like me?" I looked at her for a long moment, seeing myself 3 years ago. "I tell you this, be thorough. Verify everything 3 times. Get your facts absolutely right. Then, when you're sure, tell the truth. The consequences will come. They always do when you challenge power. But you'll be able to look at yourself in the mirror, and you might change your town. Isn't that worth it?" She nodded slowly, determination replacing fear in her eyes. "It is. Thank you." As I left Columbia that evening, walking through Manhattan streets, I realized something profound. My trial hadn't just been about me. It had been a test case for whether truth could survive in an age of powerful people trying to suppress it. The verdict had been clear. Truth can survive, but only if people are willing to fight for it. I continued my work as an investigative journalist, though now with a higher profile and more resources. Donations from supporters had allowed me to expand the unveiled truth into a small non-profit newsroom. We hired 3 other journalists. We published investigations that other outlets were too afraid to touch. Senator Blythe was eventually indicted on 14 counts of corruption. Police Commissioner DeLuca resigned. The families from Riverside received a settlement, not enough to undo the harm, but something. And I kept writing, because that's what journalists do. We write, we investigate, we expose. We tell stories that need to be told regardless of the cost. My pen had been called dangerous, they were right, but not because it spread lies, because it revealed truth. And in a world built on lies, truth is the most dangerous weapon of all. What about your city? Where do you think stories like this need to be told? Drop the name in the comments, because somewhere near you, someone needs their truth told. And maybe, just maybe, you'll be the one brave enough to tell it.